Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our last reading of the season, and I am so excited, thrilled to have Darrel J. McLeod with us today to share a reading from his memoir, Peyakow, Reclaiming Cree Dignity. It's a follow-up to his first memoir, which was the Governor General Award-winning Mamaskatch. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I am in Tikaronto, the traditional land of the Wendat, Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and I am very grateful to have the opportunity to work in this community on their territory. Darrel McLeod. Hanze, and welcome to Junction Reads. I have been excited to have you with us for months now, ever since I picked up Mamaskatch and started reading it. And then when I got Peyakow, the minute it was released, I was thrilled. Before we get started, and before I share your biography and you share some words from Peyakow, I would love to know what you're reading right now.
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question, Allison, because something interesting has happened to me. I'm working on my first novel right now.
Ooh.
And this dynamic has started happening between my reading and my writing. I mean, I'd read some famous author said that if you want to be a good reader, you have a good writer, you have to be an avid reader.
Yeah.
And so I took that to heart. And so every book that I've read since I started writing my first novel has impacted my novel. It's affected the structure of it, some of the language of it, the depth of the characters, the depth of the scenes. It's really quite intriguing. So one of the most memorable books I read in the last little while is my friend Shana Lambert's book, Petra.
Nice.
And about a woman who founded the Green Party in Germany. And it's an amazing book, and it's getting a lot of positive uptake, and it really inspired me to give my characters a little more depth in my book. And I just love the descriptions that she uses and the incredible depth of her characters and brilliant dialogue. And then there's this book by Ian McEwan, which is a classic. A lot of you would know about Ian McEwan, but it changed the structure, inspired me to change the structure of my novel and really simplify it. Because it's a simple narrative that takes, my book is a simple narrative that takes place over the span of 1 year. And so it doesn't need all these chapter headings and divisions and stuff like that. It needs to have a really good flow. This is another book, Gabrielle Garcia Marquez, that I'm reading in Spanish, Crónica de una muerte anunciada. And this book inspired me so much for some sections in Mamaskatch, where I did some stuff that I didn't think I could possibly do.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm reading all kinds of good things. There's this other book by a Cuban author that I just read last month. I don't know if people know of Chantal Acevedo. She's a professor of writing and brilliant author. I was just so moved. And she's got this really unique storytelling voice that, like we all kind of grew up with as children.
Yeah.
But yet it's complex.
Yeah,
it's quite complex, but still she's got this love. She has a way of lulling you into her world and into the universe that she creates in her book. So I'm doing a lot of reading, and loving it.
Last ones, Gabrielle Garcia Marquez is in Spanish, but is Chantal's book in Spanish as well?
No, it isn't. It's Distant Marvels. It's in English.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I couldn't. Yeah. I need thicker glasses. That's fantastic. I love, do you feel, because sometimes when I'm writing, I do the same thing. I'm always surrounded by books, picking them up. Do you feel when you're influenced by a structural element or something very obvious in someone else's book, do you feel like you've had a light bulb moment where you're like, wow, this is exactly how I should be writing?
Yeah, I really do. Sometimes it's crystal clear to me that what kinds of changes I want to make to the novel that I'm working on right now. sometimes it's absolutely like when I read Ian McEwan's Amsterdam, I knew right away because I've been struggling with the structure of my book, and I knew just keep it simple, really, really simple.
Yeah,
And so that was great.
that's great. That's awesome.
Yeah,
I am so excited to hear you read, but before you read, is it okay if I share your biography with everybody?
please, yes, please do.
Darrel J. McLeod is Cree from Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta. His 2018 memoir, Mamaskatch, won the Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction and was shortlisted for several other major prizes. Before he became an award-winning writer, Darrel worked as an educator, chief negotiator of land claims for the federal government, and executive director of education and international affairs with the Assembly of First Nations. He holds degrees in French literature and education from the University of British Columbia. Darrel has a home in Souk, BC, but is currently in Puerto Vallarta. Darrel divides his time between writing and singing in a jazz band, which I'm really excited if we have enough time, we are going to get to hear Darrel sing. But right now, Darrel, please, would you share some words with us?
All right. Darrel isiga so waya utinia amisquachi wastahigan utinia Doris Bertha Negawi Sunny Notui. So I just did my own traditional introduction in Cree, telling you where I'm from and who my mother and father are. That's what we do. And I just add wishing blessings on all my friends and family and you. And I live and work in the territory of South First Nation near Victoria on Vancouver Island. And it's a pleasure and honor to be there, and I'm supported by the ancestors of the place in my work, and supported and inspired. And I also just want to take a minute. I'm really happy that I've got a smile today. It hasn't been there for a couple of days since I heard about the 215 students at the Kamloops residential school. And I was worried about today because I wasn't sure I would be able to do it actually, because I've been really sad and working through that. But so I just like to acknowledge those beautiful, precious children who, Indigenous children from Kamloops First Nation and other local First Nations, Sequepan people and others, probably some Shuswap people who lost their lives in that situation of horror. So I'm hoping and praying that we find some resolution, some way of moving forward with the families who discover that it was indeed their children who were lost there. So I'm going to read from, and I do talk about the residential school situation and its impact on my family in Mamaskatch. I talk about my mother's escape, and my mother escaped with my aunts from a residential school that they were in Northern Alberta. And it's a beautiful Victoria story. I love that story. And in my second book, I talk about in my career, I got to work with the Nuu-chah-nulth First Nation, the Nuu-chah-nulth tribe, actually. There are 15 First Nations that compose the Nuu-chah-nulth tribe. On Vancouver Island, I got to work on a residential school apology. I was the lead person. Sounds strange to say negotiating an apology, but that's essentially what it was. And we ended up doing a very profound, moving, heartfelt, in-depth apology to the Nuu-chah-nulth, and it was delivered by a deputy minister of Indian Affairs at the time. And so a lot of that text from that apology is quoted in the book, referenced in the book, because it was such, I think it was more powerful than the national apology that was made in the House of Parliament by the Prime Minister. So I'm not going to read about that from that section today, though I'm going to read from the last section, which is entitled Kichigamis. And I'm glad I mentioned, it's funny how things have a way of coming together. I'm glad I mentioned Gabrielle Garcia Marquez, because it was his work that really enabled me, that gave me the courage to do what I did in the last chapter of this book, because it has a bit of a feel of magic realism, as you'll see when I'm reading it. And it's inspired, this chapter is inspired by two dreams that I had. That it was the type of dream as an author where you know you're going to have to write about. It were two dreams that I knew I had to write about. So I woke up in the morning, grabbed a pen and paper, and just scribbled things down as quickly as I could. And sure enough, they ended up being portrayed in this book. So the one dream was that it was my birthday, and I was in my little house in Souk. I live on an acreage, a small acreage there. And all of my family came for my birthday. And it was like in Gabrielle Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, Cien Años de Soledad. It was like 6 generations or 8 generations of people that were there, going back to my great grandparents, and they were all there. It was just quite something. And my mother, Bertha Dora, and my mushum, who's my great grandfather, who I write about a lot in Mamaskatch and in Peyakow, sort of take charge of the situation and organize everything for all of these people who have come for my birthday. I was alone for my birthday, by the way, so it's interesting how the universe and our psyche has a way of giving us what we need, isn't it? So here we go, from Kichigamis in Peyakow. As the west sea breeze picked up outside, it magically conjured a wall of fog from the ocean's surface and pushed it toward us, chilling the air. An unusual pigeon with a delicate white crescent around its neck landed on an elder bush covered with drying red berries and pecked away at them before flying off again. A robin splashed around in the green plastic plant tray that served as a bird bath, sitting atop a hemlock stump. A raven's somber haw, haw, croak in the forest. My mother, my sister Debbie, and sister Trina were visiting with Gayleen, who was the fairest at the house so far. Mother appeared distraught, on the verge of tears. Everyone in the room knew she was about to say something important, so they hushed. I feel so upset that me and my brothers, Louis, Jack, and Andy, and our aunties have to translate for Mushum and Kukum because you kids can't talk Cree. So unfair. But I thought I'd done the right thing. You too, sis, when we taught you kids English and told you to speak it every time you asked us to say how to say a Cree word. The nuns brainwashed us into thinking our language was bad and our culture was evil, and I fell for it. Should have been smarter, even though I was only a kid at the time. Now I see I was wrong. In just 2 generations, we're losing our beautiful language, Nehiao. I still love it, and it's the language I dream in, but I see it will be impossible to bring it back in our family. Such a tragic mistake, horrible, because Nehiao ain't like Chinese, Hebrew, or Swedish. All them languages got a home base, son. Millions of people speak them in their everyday life. They won't ever get lost. But our home territory, our vast land was stolen, and our language could be lost in 20 years and nobody cares. I feel so ashamed of what I've done. Darrel and Trina speak some, but Debbie's kids and grandkids don't speak a word. 2 generations and it's lost. Hurts so much to see that you kids can't talk with Mushum and Kukum the way I done my whole life. We've always been close. How can you get close to a person if you can't share a simple conversation or have some cultural things in common? Wow, so squats, Mother moaned as she left the room. I went after her. Mom, it's not your fault. They punished you. It was more like torture for a 7-year-old. Bread and water for 2 days for speaking Cree, remember? Someone had moved the yellow cedar ceremonial rattle carved in the shape of an eagle's head that usually sat on a brick shelf over by the wood stove. Likely Mushum, but where had he put it? How can you ever forgive me, son? We were separated by this barrier of language our whole lives. Now I see it so clearly. You can't even talk to your Mushum and Kukum. It hurts so much to see the longing in your eyes to speak with them, to go deep, and you can't. Mushum joined us and put his arm around Mother's shoulder. Mate pone mato and dance. Don't worry, be happy, he said. Mother glanced at him and forced a smile. Mushum was right. What was the point in worrying? More important to pray. When Mother and I returned to the family room, Mushum, Kukum, and a few uncles and aunties were talking. Uncle Jack translated snippets to let the rest of us in on their conversation. When they were young, our people were the majority, Kukum said. It was like that for decades, so most Muniawak white people learned Cree to trade with us and make money. Some nuns and priests spoke it really good, even wrote it down, but they brought diseases that killed so many of our people. They put a bounty on the heads of the buffalo to starve our cousins on the plains, force them onto the reserves, and us too. We used to join them in their hunting parties. Mother, Auntie Margaret, Uncle Jack, and the other Cree speakers all nodded. We sat in silence for a few minutes, staring down or straight ahead. Kukum cleared her throat, then continued. Once the Muniawak outnumbered us, they tore apart our culture one piece at a time. Outlawed powwows and gatherings, our form of government, took our kids away when they were still really small to teach them English, brought French-speaking nuns and priests to teach it to them along with their religion. They themselves hardly spoke English and never used it amongst themselves, spoke Francais, Wemstigoso, forced us to end our seasonal migration from the northern bush to the Rocky Mountains, fed us whiskey, Iskotewapoi, till it ruined us. A really bad dream, too bad to be true. She glanced around the room. We didn't have no heaven or hell before they came, and we weren't ashamed of our own nakedness. We enjoyed sex and talked about it freely. We didn't hide it away in darkness. We didn't have to. We didn't have VD. Their men brought that. We ate good. Nobody was fat or had diabetes. And we knew how to laugh, a good belly laugh that healed us and kept us going. Then more quiet. I remember this type of silence when we were content just to be together and sit there happy with life. After a while, Mushum spoke to Mother in Cree. She turned to me. He wants us to tell you about his travels, my man. I told him that you've traveled to many places. I didn't know where to start, so I began with the Three Sisters Mountains in Canmore, how I'd marveled at them at the age of 10. They'd become my surrogate grandmothers. Did Mushum know there were Cree names for those mountains? Then the beauty of BC. I couldn't settle on one place, so I described the other rocky and coastal mountains. I loved the waterfalls that adorned them like diamond necklaces, rivers, streams, mineral hot springs, lakes, and ocean, magnificent forests of cedar and spruce. I told them how nature had healed me and given me new vigor right there at my little house near Souk. I told them about Mexico, the jungle, warm ocean, masses of cinnamon-colored faces, mangoes, coconuts, the Huichol people. During the spring and fall equinoxes, the setting sun turned the shadow on the steps at Chichen Itza into an illusion of a Mayan deity, a feathered serpent slithering down its banister. The Aztecs called the same deity Quetzalcoatl, god of wind and rain, of knowledge and learning. I described how the Mapuche and other peoples of Argentina had welcomed me, sharing their ceremonies and feast. Mushum turned again to Mother, shook his head, nodded in my direction, and said, Ma sosquats, Peyakow. He can't believe you did all those travels alone, son. You took our spirit to all those places, alone.
Thank you so much for sharing one of my favorite chapters in the book.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, and the first one, the dream stories are my favorite.
Oh, good to
I
know.
I'm glad that you read that one because it made me think a lot about how close I felt to the throughout the book, even though the language and whether it was Spanish, French, or Nehiyaw Cree, even though there was no translation ever offered or any interpretation or meaning, which at times in certain books can alienate a reader, I really did feel closer to you
Hmm.
when I read it. And you know, of course, likely not pronouncing it properly or anything like that, but just reading the language, I felt closer to you in reading the book. Was this a conscious decision on your part to not translate to not include translations when you used other languages?
Well, when I was working on Mamaskatch, both books are structured in the short story format, linked short stories. When I was working on a story in Mamaskatch called Hail Mary Full of Grace, I submitted it to an editor named Douglas Glover, and he has his own online magazine called Numero 5. And so he edited it, and I have to say I was really intimidated because he's a master of the craft. He's written a couple of books on it. He teaches at a prestigious university, and he's won a few big awards. And I saw on his website a story he had edited for Margaret, was it not Margaret Atwood? It was, I think it was Margaret Lawrence, or it was, anyway, one of the big names. And it had lines and squiggles, and it was just covered with red ink. And I thought, oh man, if he did that to one of those authors, what's he going to do to my story? But he just wanted the ending changed.
But wow.
But during the course of our working together, he's the one who convinced me not to translate the Cree. And I had done that. Either I had the translation embedded in some way without interrupting the narrative, or I had put something else in, like a character responding or echoing what had been said in English, so the reader would get. And he said, don't do that. You're spoiling the effect. People need to feel what those little girls, what Cree speakers felt when they were forced to learn a foreign language without any supports. So it's been a conscious decision since then, every time, for sure.
Yeah.
Although friends who are respected authors have suggested that I could perhaps put a glossary, a Cree English glossary at the end of the book or something, or in future editions. So I'm thinking about that. And in my novel, I am actually doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there were times that I felt like I want, maybe can I put the book down and Google this and try and find the translation? But I stopped myself because I didn't want to be taken out of the story. And so I love the idea of a glossary, because I feel like an opportunity to learn is, especially languages that are being lost, is essential. But I don't know if I would want to know that it's there. I guess I would know, but yeah. No,
Yeah, it could be distracting. I mean, having studied French and English, I mean, for example, when I read Garcia Marquez book, it would be very distracting if there were a glossary at the end, because I know I'd be flipping back and forth.
Yeah.
And it would kind of disrupt the narrative.
Yeah, I would too. And I really had to, especially in the, or not especially, but at the, in the more political chapters, when you mention people with initials and not names, I had this urge to drop the book, get the internet going to try and figure out exactly who they were. But then I thought, I don't think that Darrel wants me to know who they are. I don't think that it matters who they are or what their political perspective is, and why waste my time Googling them or researching them. You talked about the structure of Mamaskatch and Peyakow, and writing in these collected short stories, I guess. The one thing that I thought about as a writer, again, this is not a readerly thing because it didn't pull me out as a reader, but as a writer, I was wondering, in some chapters, you've got titles within the chapters, like there's little moments, I guess, that are broken down with their own titles. And then some of the other chapters, there's just that little diamond, breaking up the time and space. Was that an editorial thing that was brought to you, or was that something that in the natural course of you writing each of the stories, you thought these are going to need more than just a break, more than just a symbol?
Right, that's a good question. In Peyakow, those divisions within chapters happen quite organically. And I think it comes from, my first university degree is in literature, French literature. And I did a lot of reading in Spanish at that time too. And you know, I've been a prolific reader ever since. And a lot of that stuff just rubs off on us, right?
Yeah.
Quite naturally, and comes out organically when we're writing. We don't even remember or recall which author influenced us for a particular style or structure or format necessarily. We may recall, but they're, so with those specific chapters, I just wanted to give, like one of them is Indian Affairs.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to give the reader a bit of a heads up that there's something different about to happen in this section.
Yeah.
So it's like a story within a story, or a vignette, I guess, within a story.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to kind of demarcate those vignettes.
Right.
And in the editing process, one editor, not my main editor, but one editor who I worked with, a brilliant person, did suggest possibly that that was disrupting the flow a bit too much in the chapters where they're found in. So I reread them a few times, gave them some time, you know, put them aside for a while and reread them. And I decided I really liked the subheadings, so I kept them. And I think they work.
Yeah, well, especially I can't remember if it's towards the end of the Indian Affairs chapter where you have the dates.
Oh yeah, that was in the Condor and the Eagle, the trip to Argentina.
Right.
Part of it is from a journal. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, and I like that because it gives you that kind of refreshing, like refresh your mind. This is a completely different day. Yeah, this isn't a continuation of the narrative. This is a completely different headspace, I guess. But yeah, I wasn't as a reader, as I said, I wasn't brought out of anything with the breaks, whether they were titles or not. I just, in looking it over, you know, doing the second read as a writer, which I do quite often, I was wondering, you know, how that came about. So thank you for answering my question. Another big theme that came to me, or not theme, another big thing that I was thinking about throughout the novel was this question of identity. And at the beginning of the chapter or story that's titled "The Carved Cedar Brentwood Box in the Trunk," you express a desire to be another, or what you imagine the other to be. And I was thinking about this incredible working life that you've had: teacher, negotiator, mediator, even interpreter. And I was wondering about how you straddled, or how you find yourself straddling two different spaces. Because as we talked about at the beginning, the book itself is opened and closed with these dreamlike stories where you meet your mushroom, or he comes to you, or you go to him, and you're like the caring interpreter of the past, the interpreter of their stories almost, and the stories of your siblings and the other people you lost throughout the book. I wanted to hear what your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, that's an interesting question. And, you know, I could go on for a long time about that topic. I talk in a book about a poem by an Indigenous poet named Christos. And she talks in there about being sandpaper, you know, the rub between two cultures.
Yeah.
And fairly into my work in post-secondary education, I really felt the rub. I felt there's a lot of tension. It was interesting. The more I got embedded in my culture and more familiar with my own culture and practicing my own culture, the more there was a rub. So that's kind of interesting and curious. And I haven't really reflected on that a lot. That's just occurring to me as a result of the question. That'll be an interesting issue to think about. But I found I had to, it was a constant negotiation throughout my career.
Yeah.
There were many wonderful people who treated me equally, you know, who didn't treat me differently. There were some people who were extra kind and generous, understood that I must have been facing challenges that they weren't.
Mm-hmm.
But there were people who just were, you know, difficult and made life difficult for me. And I didn't write about all of the stories in Peyakow because sometimes petty
Mm-hmm.
and unkind stories that I didn't want out there in the world. Um, people who undermined my career.
Yeah.
Once I got promoted to an executive in the federal government, for example, there was a lot of jealousy by others, not Indigenous people, by non-Indigenous people around me who wished they had. And I've said to many friends, and many of my peers who are Indigenous professionals have also echoed my sentiments, that when you're Indigenous in a professional environment, you have to be twice as good
Yeah.
to be considered half as good, and you have to work twice as hard to be considered half as accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that. So I worked really hard and I got ahead and I had an awesome career.
Yeah.
But had there not been obstructive behaviors and discrimination, I would have gotten much farther. Not that I lament that. I had a very good life and still do.
Yeah.
And when I was at the point in my career where I could take an early retirement, I made a decision that either you go big and get a big promotion or you go home and
Right.
do something else and manage my own life. So I decided to leave government, and Stephen Harper helped me do that because he had a real hatred for the bureaucracy and he took an axe to it, as we all know. So he helped me, facilitated his actions and policies helped facilitate an early retirement for me.
Right.
And I have a friend who's an amazing intellectual and accomplished individual. And he said to me at one point, why don't you write a book? And that echoed sentiments from others, like an elder I'd worked with in Northern BC, Catherine Bird, and so on. So the alternative turned out to be great. I flew the coop at an early age, at a relatively young age.
Yeah.
And I got to, I didn't know I would have this passion for writing the way I do
Yeah.
at that stage when I was in my early 50s. But I knew I would do music, and that's what I expected to be doing passionately, was music almost full time. I expected that. But writing took over, and I became passionate about that. And I was obsessed with, once I knew Mamaskatch, my first memoir, had legs, working with an amazing author, Betsy Warland, and then another amazing author, Shane Lambert, as mentors. Once I knew Mamaskatch had legs, I became obsessed, and I was working like 8 to 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. I just had to get it done. And similar with Peyakow, and it's interesting, I'm rambling a bit here, but interesting ideas have been occurring lately, in part because of the Kamloops residential school situation that I mentioned earlier. I didn't understand, and my friends and mentors didn't understand, why I was so driven to get these books done and out in the world, but I was driven.
Yeah.
And I remember my dear friend Shayna Lambert saying to me at one point, well, they'll come out when the time is right. And, you don't have to feel rushed or pressured, but I had this inexplicable pressure to get them done and get them out into the world. And now I understand what that pressure was. The timing was right.
Mm-hmm.
It's important subject material. There are incredibly important issues that I cover in both of these books and all of the chapters. So that was the drive there.
Yeah. I've recommended both books to I don't know how many of my writer friends, and not just we share books that are well written. We don't necessarily share books for the story, but we share books because they're well written. Much like you talk about the influence from other books and other writers. And I have recommended this book for the incredible writing, for the powerful voice, but also, as you say, this needs to be read. People need to read these stories, and kids haven't been told these stories. Teenagers and young adults are coming into it from a social media perspective, and I would love if more people in their 20s and 30s were reading your work and not reading someone's opinion on social media. So I agree with you. It's so important. And it surprises me when I read somewhere that you hadn't thought of being a writer, because you're so incredible. And I can't imagine your voice not existing right now in our CanLit world.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's quite
Yeah,
a compliment, and coming from you, Allison, that means a lot. So
thank
thank you.
I'm just me. I have one more question, and I'm sorry everybody for taking the time because I want to talk to you about music and writing.
Yeah.
But if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and Darrel will answer them for you as best he can. So I am so impressed by your musical talents. I've watched a bunch of videos, and I'm now obsessed. And you mentioned before we officially started the meeting that you've just finished the last finishing touches on your second album. My question is about, as an art form, music, and as an art form, writing, your approach to them uh, seems to be, or it seems to be that they can't be separated. There's so much music in Peyakow, and so much of your love of music is expressed in Peyakow. What would you say is your different approaches to when you sit down to write, or when you sit down to rehearse or practice singing?
Well, I've had some interesting reflections on that recently too, because I've really ramped up the music side, and the writing has been ramped up for 6 years now. But
Mhm.
the music side is kind of half of my space, and my time wise and energy wise, it's about half of my space. And one of the dynamic feedback loops, I guess, not to sound too technical, between my music and my writing is that singing puts me in this amazing space. It just gives me such peace and focus and presence of mind and spirit that I can get into my work.
Yeah.
And I also listen to music when I'm writing. When I was writing Mamaskatch and Peyakow, I would put on, well, depending. If I was writing a difficult chapter, I put on the French soprano I mentioned actually in Peyakow, Emma
Yeah.
Chaplin. I listened to her music all the time. And if I was writing a chapter that was emotionally difficult, I would put on Emma Chaplin before, during, and after
Wow.
the writing session, and listen to her for hours and hours. There's one album, Carmine Mio, that I would listen to over and over again. But I've just recently started taking music composition with a brilliant maestro, a young man in Victoria. I'm taking the course online, but I've been working with Wes on guitar and vocal interpretation for a few years now. But he's a brilliant composer and a genius at theory instruction as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know if many people have taken music theory, but it's hard to make it interesting and applied and useful.
Yeah.
But Wes is a genius at that. So I started taking music composition with him. And uh, during the course of writing Peyakow and then my novel now, I've learned this technique from the Sarah Selecki School of Writing. I took a course there and then I taught in it about writing story starters. And she has this method, which I won't get into, about writing story starters. But you write 5 to 10 story starters when you're doing that exercise, with
Right.
the goal that you're really going to use them, if they're keepers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I did that. And in this music composition course, I decided to do the same thing.
Oh,
So
wow.
Wes talked to me, then my maestro friend talked to me about finding hooks. The hook is the big thing for the song.
Yeah.
And so I
That's the
did the
story
same
start.
thing. I listened to openings to maybe 10 of my favorite jazz songs, just to the first 8 bars kind of thing.
Mhm.
Identified the hook, and usually it's just a few notes. You think of play Misty form, da da da, or summertime,
Yeah.
and you recognize those tunes just with that hook. So I did that. I after listening to my favorite songs, 8 or 10 of them, I just focused on writing the opening bar or two for what are going to become my songs. And
Mhm.
it's working so well. It's just
Wow,
great.
that's fantastic.
And then I was telling you when we were chatting just before we got started today, that today I was putting the finishing touches on my second album. And I just felt like I was doing the same thing as editing my writing. I had to listen. Oh, okay, play that back again, play that back again. I think, that note was a little bit off, or, the rhythm was a little bit off. Let's do it over. and
Yeah.
just that section. And, studio technicians are brilliant. They can, if you have a good one and with good equipment, they can take you right to where your little issue is in your music. You can graft something new onto it. So yeah, there's a lot of, and the more I get into music and the more I get into my writing, the more there's this interplay between the two. It's really fun.
Yeah.
Very demanding though, and very tiring to
I'm
try and
sure.
do both. It's a bit exhausting sometimes.
I'm sure. I think all of us as writers need that technician to go in and find the part in the novel that needs to be fixed and just immediately fix it without us having to, slog through it. That would be,
Yeah, and putting ego aside, especially
yeah,
now with technology, with cut and paste, for writing and
yeah,
cutting and pasting for music, just putting ego aside and being easy and gentle with yourself.
yeah,
This is another thing I've learned with my editing for my own writing, is to be as respectful of my own work as I would anybody else's work. So not go in with, with an X-Acto knife.
yeah,
To go in delicately with a surgeon's scalpel, and you're only going to touch the part that needs to get touched and
yeah,
nothing else. Once you're at that relatively advanced stage, yeah.
yeah. It is difficult to go into your own work and leave the judge like in the back room, Thank you so much for sharing that. Kaylee, do we have any questions from our audience?
We do. We have a few. So the first one is from Jared, and Jared has a language education background and did some reading specifically on intergenerational language loss, Indigenous language revitalization, and policy planning, etc. And his question is, what is the function of written storytelling, specifically in contributing to Indigenous language revitalization, reflecting on the intergenerational gap arising from the loss of Cree proficiency that you read about?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you, Jared. And it's an important one to consider. The written form of traditional stories is of course helpful in preserving those stories, that they'll be passed on from generation to generation. But we also don't want to lose the art of oral storytelling. So while it's important to get them in written form, I hope that we also keep up the art of actually verbally telling those stories.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are workshops and courses one can take on storytelling that I've taken in the past that really do help. And it's a wonderful art that I hope never gets lost. So there is that slight danger that we end up relying a little bit too much on the written form now that we have it and it's so accessible. I love what slam poets are doing, that they're performance people. And that is just so great. And, I think, and I guess I'm preaching to myself here, not that I mean to preach, but I guess I'm kind of talking to myself that I should, in addition to writing these books, I should be doing more storytelling as well. There are some trends out there that aren't specifically in Indigenous communities, but certainly that Indigenous communities and artists can benefit from. And it's things like storytelling, improvisation, that kind of, it's poetry, doing slam poetry, even rap music, things like that, I think are formats that could really help. I'm hoping that more and more we get telling our stories in our own languages again, because that's so rich. And I have a few books of Cree stories in Cree. They're in both Cree and English, and I love that because I can go back and forth because I'm not fluent in Cree. And the written form of our language, and I'm not criticizing anybody, I'm speaking only from my own point of view. I struggle with it because linguists have done amazing work in Indigenous languages, but I'm not sure that we yet have the best kind of alphabet and system for capturing our language in a written form, because none of them have really caught on. If they were a slam dunk and really straightforward, people would be, yeah, here's a Cree story, read it. It isn't like that. So, it's tricky. I'm hoping that there are more and more Indigenous language programs cropping up in universities across the country and in colleges and in Indigenous run colleges. And I'm hoping that they incorporate storytelling as part of the language education. That would be just wonderful.
Mm-hmm. And how, just before we came in, there I was reading about the Cree language, and that exactly that, finding out where you could learn it, and whether non-Indigenous people should be learning it without having a community context or whatever. How do you feel about that? About Cree or Ojibwe or anything being taught in our schools?
Well, I have strong feelings about that because, as you said, and I don't know if this was in my bio or not, but I'm fluent in French and Spanish, and I've worked very hard to get the level of fluency I have. And I loved the process. And I'm also I've worked hard at getting fluent in Cree, but I'm more fluent in French and Spanish because I can use it anywhere, anytime, almost.
Mm-hmm.
And Cree is much more challenging to find speakers, especially out in Victoria, you know, in Coast Salish territory. There are some urban people who speak Cree, but not many. And I'm jealous of Chinese people or people from other countries who have a large population base in places like Vancouver or Toronto or wherever, because they can live their lives in their language if they want to. They can go to the bank in their language, they can go to the dentist in their language, they can get medical care, they can visit in their language, and it's wonderful. And I think it's amazing. There are a few cultures that have managed to carry that on from generation to generation. In the case of Chinese Canadians, some families, maybe 5, 6, 7 generations have carried it on. That's wonderful. And that's something I think we can learn from.
Yeah.
So we need more language programming around the country, and we need more and virtual stuff online, you know, with Zoom, that we're used to that medium, and you can have up to 200 people on a Zoom meeting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm hoping that technology helps us to revitalize our languages as well.
Yeah, that's actually a great idea. Having like large groups of people from across Turtle Island just joining Zooms and having conversations, that would be a spectacular.
Halfway.
Yeah, yeah. Kaylee, sorry.
Yeah, we have a question from Laura, and Laura asks, what role can audiobooks play in the revitalization and continuation of oral storytelling? Did you record any of your own audiobooks for your memoirs?
I think audiobooks can, of course, be great. It's become a very popular medium, and it's wonderful. And my book, well, Mamaskatch is already out as an audiobook. Peyakow was possibly in process, but no, I didn't. I got to audition, and I could have probably insisted that it be me who read Mamaskatch, but I was so busy working on Peyakow that at the time when the possibility came up, I was just too busy, and I would have had to down tools and go to Montreal or New York for a few weeks or a month to do the recording, and I just wasn't in the right space for it. But the other thing is, a friend of mine who's, was my Spanish teacher, suggested we work on translating my book Mamaskatch into Spanish together, and we did the first chapter, and it was just too emotional for me.
Oh, really?
It just brought me right in close to my work and what I had said in it, and back to my family and all the emotions I felt when I was writing it. And so I just, because when you're translating something, you're studying it in detail, right? And then trying to get what was the feel and what was the idea and what was the intent, and you try to get that in the second language. But so I just couldn't do it. But audiobooks are important, and there are more and more resources online in Cree language and other Indigenous languages that are wonderful, like children's books. They're brilliant, and children's audiobooks are absolutely brilliant, and it'll certainly help with language revitalization, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. Kaylee?
Yep, we have one last question, and this question is from Ren. Ren asks, as a writer and your work as a treaty negotiator, how frustrating was it? And you don't name people, but only share initials. Was this a legal thing, or did you just not want the reader to be drawn into those politics? So kind of related to something Allison had discussed earlier.
Well, that's an interesting question. And how frustrating was it? Well, it was incredibly challenging, but I thrived on it. I love the challenge of that environment of doing treaty negotiations. In both settings, I was the senior negotiator for a treaty with the Nuu-Chah Tribal Council, 13 First Nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and they're brilliant people who know what they want, and they had seasoned, experienced, smart negotiators with, in many cases, with an amazing education and so on. And then I got to work with brilliant people on the federal team and brilliant and challenging people on the provincial team. And you get to deal, like I got to deal with fisheries, and I learned more. We downed tools, and this was my idea, because we were having very confrontational discussions on things like fisheries and health, topics that had a very technical component to them and a lot of information to share. And I realized from my education background that in many of the discussions we were talking at cross purposes. We were using the same words in some cases, but not with the same common understanding. So for fisheries, for example, we downed tools, and I got oriented to fisheries on the west coast of Vancouver Island for about 6 months. But we did it as a tripartite table with provincial government there and the Nuu-Chah there. And that was absolutely brilliant. And it was one of the richest times in my life. And so it's challenging. There's a technical aspect that's challenging, learning the technical aspect of all these different subject matters, and then working with a team of lawyers and understanding the legal perspectives. And you have to work with financial analysts and understanding all the accounting and financial components. And then there's the challenge of negotiating, the actual act of negotiating, and communicating clearly and avoiding conflict, at times dealing with difficult personalities on all sides of the table.
Yeah.
The most frustrating thing for me as a federal negotiator, both when I was a senior negotiator and then a chief negotiator, was the internal work and dealing with the internal bodies that I had to deal with to approve what we negotiated. And those were I don't mean to be mean saying this, but those were the hardest nuts to crack.
Yeah.
Like, there were people who brought their own personal agendas. There were lawyers, for example, or senior policy analysts who had their personal agenda to block the deals we were doing. And they used their position to stonewall us.
Yeah.
And that is one of the key problems in the treaty process right now, is the approval process by bureaucrats within the federal government.
Yeah.
People are allowed, and they were allowed to come with their person. It was obvious to all of us that it wasn't a government issue, that was a mandate issue. It was a personal agenda that had to play itself out.
Yeah.
So that was really, really frustrating. And my next book, after I finish the novel I'm working on now, is it's called A Season in Cheskun. That's the working title
of the novel.
The next book is going to be about a young treaty negotiator.
Oh, wow.
And his life. And so a lot of it won't be a memoir. It's going to definitely be fictionalized. Mm-hmm. And that leads into the second part of the question, but why the initials? Yes, part of it was for legal concerns. Part of it was, not wanting to get bogged down. And that's a brilliant analysis. For example, not wanting to mention specific names of specific politicians. I didn't want their story to, sort of preempt mine or to supersede the story of my life and my family and the story of an Indigenous man in Canada. I didn't want that to become the issue. And there were legal considerations too, because, I deal with corruption in government in Peyakow, and how to name the names. There would be potential repercussions. Those people could have disagreed with me and said that I was out to lunch, although I'm pretty sure they won't come forward.
Right.
Because they don't want people to know that it's them I'm talking about necessarily. But there are some big issues that could potentially be big scandals if anybody chooses to dig deeper with them. Yeah.
No, and that was, it seemed obvious to me that what you just, as you mentioned, the personal agendas being brought forward, and that I can't remember who was at the lunch, but the lunch where whomever you were with invited somebody that you knew over, had a
Oh yeah.
1 second conversation and then turned to everyone at the table and said, well, now we can expense it because we've had this.
Yeah, now our dinner's on the Queen. Yeah.
So disgusting. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And the political cycle, right? This kind of every 4 years, you've got 4 years to get something done or 4 years to get nothing done, depending on who you've got, like Stephen Harper, for example.
Mhm.
I don't want to go on anymore because we've got a couple of minutes left. And I had asked at the beginning if you would sing for us. I really hope that you will.
Mm.
Would you? Or am I putting you?
Sure. My theme song right now is Blue Skies. I love that song, and I'm hoping that it is kind of prophetic about my future and our collective future.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to sing that. In Peyakow, there's a title called Fly Me to the Moon, because it's one of the first songs that I learned when I became a jazz singer in Puerto Vallarta about 4 years ago, and I had my own show on Friday evenings at a club called the Jazz Foundation.
Yeah.
So I'll just sing a little bit of that song for you.
Okay.
It's one of my favorites, and it was my theme song before Blue Skies because I love a couple of lines in it. So fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, come on and kiss me. Fill my life with song. Let me sing forevermore. You are all I long for, all I worship and adore. In other words, please be true. In other words, I love you. That's a good note to end on.
Awesome.
Sending lots of love to everybody, that's for sure.
Yes.
The line in there the reason I chose that song was the line, fill my heart with song, let me sing forevermore. So that song was my theme song for about 5 years.
Wow, I love that. I should have thought about this structurally because I should have got you to sing us out, but now we have to go to the raffle. We should have done the raffle.
That's okay.
I should have got you to sing us out.
If I was organized to have my music playing in the background.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, we should have thought of that. So Karina, who, as you know, is a lovely publicist at Douglas and McIntyre.
Yes, indeed.
2 copies of your book to raffle off today, which is thrilling for everyone in the audience. So just come back to your computers, everybody. Kaylee is going to do the raffle of 2 copies of Peyakow.
I'm still on kind of analog. I need to figure out a digital version, but I still do the old school kind of names in a hat style.
We had like some kind of like live bingo.
Yeah, I'm sure that online I could find something to do it, but I kind of still like the enjoyment of doing it analog. All right, our first winner of Peyakow is Catherine Bush.
Whee!
Oh, wow, she's a friend.
Yay!
Catherine,
Wonderful,
I'm not sure if you're here, but if you can send me an email to junctionrights@gmail.com, or I can reach out to you. I also have your email.
All right, and our second winner is Claire Jarvis.
Yay!
Yay!
Wonderful.
Claire Jarvis is my roommate, so that makes it very easy for me to
nice.
get her a copy.
That's great.
Small world.
Darrel, hi. Thank you for joining us today. I am thrilled to end the season of Junction Reads with you. For everyone here, June is National Indigenous History Month. I highly recommend you go out and get yourself Mamaskatch and Peyakow, and if not, other books written by incredible Indigenous writers, and give them to friends and give them as birthday gifts. And that is all. Darrel, thank you very much. And safe travels back to Souk.
Thank you. Hi. Kinanaskomatin.
Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you, Kaylee.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for coming all.
Thank